I'll take mine black, 2 sugars, and tell them the captain wants his with cream. First Officer Blake Morrison did not look up from his tablet when he said it. He said it the way a man says a line he has said 1,000 times before, with the easy rhythm of a joke that had always landed and had never once cost him anything. Beside him in the jump seat, the relief pilot laughed. Behind him, the flight engineer, halfway through her pre-flight checklist, made the small, polite sound of a woman who did not want to laugh, but understood the political weight of laughing anyway. The cockpit of the Boeing 787 was warm with early morning sun coming through the forward windows, and the woman standing in the open cockpit door said nothing at all. She was in her mid-40s, dressed in a dark blazer and pressed navy trousers, holding a flight bag in her left hand and a slim leather folio in her right. Her hair was pulled back into a low, neat twist. She wore no jewelry except for a small pair of silver studs and a watch with a black leather band. She looked, by every visible measure, like a woman who had walked into the wrong room and was calmly deciding what to do about it. Blake Morrison, still not looking up, felt her continued presence in the doorway the way a man feels a fly he has already swatted at, and he sighed the small sigh of a man being asked to explain something obvious to someone he had decided was slow. "Ma'am," he said, finally lifting his eyes from the tablet, "the galley is down the aisle on your left. The crew rest area is for actual flight personnel. If you're looking for the jump seat lottery, that's handled at the gate, not up here." He gave her the smirk he had been perfecting for 22 years, the smirk that had made junior officers apologize for existing and had made student pilots second-guess their own logbooks. "The coffee station is right behind you. I take mine black, 2 sugars, captain likes cream, appreciate it." The woman did not move. She did not answer. Her face did not change in any way that a passenger walking past the open door would have registered. But something in her stillness had a weight to it that Blake Morrison, in the 22 years he had been climbing the seniority list at Transcontinental Airways, had never once encountered in the doorway of a cockpit. It was the stillness of a person who was not confused, not intimidated, not lost, and not going anywhere. It was the stillness of a person who was, in fact, already exactly where she was supposed to be. She walked forward, not fast, not slow. 3 steps past the jump seat, past the flight engineer's station, and directly to the left-hand seat, the captain's seat. She set the flight bag down beside it, unzipped it, and began to remove a headset and a checklist binder with the practiced economy of a person who had done this exact sequence of motions several thousand times in her life. Blake Morrison's smirk did not fall off his face all at once. It came off in stages, the way frost comes off a windshield in the morning, starting from the corners and moving inward until nothing was left but the shape it had been. "Ma'am," he said again, and this time his voice had lost the easy rhythm. It had climbed half a step and thinned out at the edges. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but that is the captain's seat, and I am going to have to ask you to step out of this cockpit immediately or I will be forced to call security." Behind him, the relief pilot had stopped smiling. The flight engineer had stopped moving entirely, her pen still hovering above the checklist. The woman in the left-hand seat had not turned to look at Blake Morrison once. She was arranging the checklist binder on the small ledge to her left, exactly the way a pilot in command arranges her materials before a briefing. And then the cockpit door, which had been left ajar behind her, pushed the rest of the way open, and Chief Pilot Raymond Delacroix stepped through it with his own folio under his arm, and a clearing of his throat that everyone in that cockpit was about to remember for the rest of their professional lives. Chief Pilot Raymond Delacroix was 61 years old, and he had been flying commercial aircraft for 38 of those years. He had a reputation inside Transcontinental Airways for 2 things. The first was that he had never in his career raised his voice inside a cockpit. The second was that he had never in his career needed to. He was a tall, spare man with silver hair combed neatly to one side, and the kind of face that had been shaped by 4 decades of maintaining professional composure at 39,000 FT, with 300 lives in the seat behind him. He wore the 4 gold stripes of a senior captain, and he wore them the way a man wears a watch he inherited from his father, with the quiet assumption that everyone in the room already understood what they meant. He stepped fully into the cockpit and closed the door behind him with a soft click. He did not look at Blake Morrison. He did not look at the relief pilot. He did not look at the flight engineer. He looked at the woman in the left-hand seat, who had by this point finished arranging her materials and was now turning slowly, unhurriedly, in her seat to face the rest of the cockpit for the first time since she had walked through the door. And when she turned, the 4 gold stripes on her sleeve, which had been mostly hidden by the angle of her body and the drape of her blazer, caught the morning light coming through the forward window and became visible to every person in that cockpit at exactly the same time. Blake Morrison saw them first. The color that had been draining from his face for the last 15 seconds arrested itself somewhere around his jawline and began, very slowly, to reverse direction. The relief pilot saw them second. He made a small, involuntary sound in the back of his throat, the kind of sound a person makes when they have just understood something they did not want to understand. The flight engineer saw them third. Her pen, which had been hovering above the checklist, dropped the last quarter-inch and landed on the paper with a small tap that was, in the sudden silence of the cockpit, the loudest sound in the room. Chief Pilot Delacroix cleared his throat. It was not a loud clearing. It was the small, precise clearing of a man who had been waiting for the room to be ready to hear him and had determined that it now was. "Gentlemen, Officer Chen." He nodded toward the flight engineer. "I would like to introduce you to Captain Janelle Hayes." He paused. He allowed the name to sit in the cockpit for 1 full second before he continued. "Captain Hayes is the newest pilot in command on the 787 fleet. She transferred to us 3 weeks ago from North Star Airways, where she was a line captain for 6 years and a check airman for the last 2. She holds an ATP with 14,000 flight hours, 9,200 of them as pilot in command on wide-body equipment." He paused again. He was looking directly at Blake Morrison now, not with anger. With the calm, assessing gaze of a senior captain who had been briefed on what had been happening in this cockpit for the last 4 minutes, and who was making, in real time, a series of decisions about the professional futures of the 3 officers in front of him. "Captain Hayes has also been designated as your check airman for the next 30 days. She will be observing and evaluating every operational decision this crew makes on every flight during the check period. That includes today's flight to Frankfurt. That includes every briefing, every checklist, every radio call, every crew resource management interaction from the moment we push back from the gate until the moment we arrive at the hotel in Frankfurt tomorrow morning." He turned very slightly toward Janelle Hayes. "Captain, I apologize for the delay. The briefing packet is in my folio. I trust you have already had a chance to introduce yourself to the crew." Janelle Hayes did not smile. She did not scowl. She did not do any of the things a lesser person might have done in the 6 seconds she had just been given. She simply looked at Blake Morrison, and she looked at the relief pilot, and she looked at Officer Chen, and she said, in a voice that was quiet and even and carried exactly as far as it needed to carry, "We were just getting acquainted, Chief. I believe First Officer Morrison was placing an order for coffee." Blake Morrison had, in the 22 years he had been flying for transcontinental airways, been in exactly 3 situations he could not talk his way out of. The first had been a bounced landing in Denver in 2011 that had cracked a nose gear strut and put him in front of a review board for 2 weeks. The second had been a domestic incident in 2016 that had ended his first marriage. The third was happening right now, in the left half of a cockpit that had gone as quiet as a chapel, with the eyes of a chief pilot and a check airman and 2 crew members he had been laughing with 90 seconds earlier all resting on him at the same time. He tried to speak. What came out was the beginning of a syllable that did not develop into a word. He closed his mouth. He opened it again. Captain Janelle Hayes was still looking at him with the same calm, patient expression she had worn in the doorway, and it occurred to Blake Morrison in that moment that the expression had not been patience at all. It had been something closer to the professional attentiveness of a person who was already conducting the evaluation, who had been conducting it from the second she had stepped through the door, and who had by this point already formed a preliminary assessment of every officer in the cockpit that would, in due course, be entered into the official record of the check period. He tried again. "Captain Hayes, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding landed in the cockpit the way a lit match lands in a bowl of water. Chief Pilot Delacroix's jaw moved very slightly. Officer Chen, at her station behind him, closed her eyes for one full second and opened them again. Janelle Hayes tilted her head about half an inch to the left. It was the smallest possible physical movement, and it carried the weight of a paragraph she had chosen not to speak out loud. "First Officer Morrison," she said, "I would like to be clear with you about something before we begin the pre-flight briefing, because clarity is going to be important between us for the next 30 days. She reached down and unzipped the outer pocket of her flight bag. From it, she removed a single laminated card, the kind of card every check airman at Transcontinental Airways carried in the outer pocket of their flight bag. It bore her photograph, her signature, her ATP certificate number, her check airman designation number, and the seal of the Federal Aviation Administration in the lower right corner. She held it up so that Blake Morrison could see it, and she held it there for exactly the length of time it took for him to read every line of text on it. "There was no misunderstanding," she said. "You saw a black woman in a blazer walk through the cockpit door of an aircraft you had already decided in your mind belonged to you, and you made a series of assumptions about who she was and what she was doing there. You said those assumptions out loud. Your colleagues laughed. That is not a misunderstanding, First Officer. A misunderstanding is when two people have interpreted the same fact in two different ways. What happened here is that you invented a fact that was not present in the room and then behaved as if it were true. Those are different things, and they will be documented differently in my report." Blake Morrison's throat moved. He did not speak. He had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, understood that speaking was no longer available to him as a tool that could improve his situation. Janelle Hayes returned the laminated card to the outer pocket of her flight bag. She zipped the pocket closed. She turned back to Chief Pilot Delacroix. "Chief, I would like to proceed with the pre-flight briefing now. We have a scheduled pushback in 47 minutes, and I want to make sure this crew has adequate time to complete all normal procedures without feeling rushed by the events of the last several minutes." Delacroix nodded once. It was a small nod, but Blake Morrison, watching it from the right-hand seat, recognized it as the nod of a chief pilot who had just observed his newest captain handle a hostile situation with more composure than he had personally demonstrated in the first 5 years of his own command career. Delacroix reached into his folio and produced the briefing packet. To understand how Captain Janelle Hayes had come to be standing in the cockpit of Transcontinental Airways, Flight 447 to Frankfurt on that particular Tuesday morning, you need to back up 32 years, to a small town in southeastern Louisiana called Plaquemine, where a 9-year-old girl had stood in a chain-link fenced yard behind a 2-bedroom house and watched a crop duster bank hard over a sugar cane field and made a decision about her life that she never once, in the 32 years that followed, revisited or reconsidered. Her father, Malcolm Hayes, had been a diesel mechanic at a shipping company in Baton Rouge. He worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and came home smelling of engine grease and cigarette smoke and the particular chemical tang of hydraulic fluid. Her mother, Patris Hayes, had worked the front desk at a small medical clinic. She had graduated high school valedictorian in 1978 and had wanted more than anything to be a nurse, but her own mother had gotten sick her senior year of high school, and there had not been money for both college and the medical bills, and Patris had made the choice 1,000 young black women had made before her and never spoken about it again. Janelle was their only child. She had been born late in her mother's life, when Patris had already given up on the idea of children, and she had grown up in the particular attentive silence of a household where two exhausted adults had poured every remaining ounce of their ambition into one small person. Patris read to her every night. Not children's books. The children's books were for the daytime. At night, Patris read her articles from Ebony and Jet and the Times-Picayune. She read her a magazine profile of Jill Brown, the first black woman to fly for a major U.S. airline, when Janelle was 7 years old, and she read it to her 3 more times over the following year because Janelle kept asking her to. When Janelle was 11, her father took her to a small regional air show in Baton Rouge. It cost $8 a ticket. Malcolm Hayes did not have $8 a ticket to spare that month, and he took her anyway. She watched a formation of T-6 Texans do a low pass over the field, and when she turned to look at her father, he was not watching the airplanes. He was watching her face. He said something to her that afternoon that she carried with her for the rest of her life. He said, "Baby, you look at those airplanes the way I used to look at engines when I was your age. You remember that. Don't nobody get to decide what you love. That's the one thing in this world that belongs to you." She got her private pilot's license at 17, working weekends at a diner in Plaquemine to pay for the flight hours. She got a full scholarship to the University of North Dakota's aviation program. She graduated at 21 with a commercial multi-engine instrument rating and a bachelor's degree in aeronautical science. She flew freight in twin-engine Cessnas out of Memphis for 3 years, sleeping in her car between overnight runs because the pay would not cover both an apartment and the flight hours she needed. She flew a regional jet for a commuter carrier out of Cincinnati for 4 years after that, working her way from first officer to captain by the time she was 29. She applied to 7 major U.S. carriers when she had her ATP and 6,000 hours. She got 3 interviews. She received 1 offer from North Star Airways, and she took it. She spent 11 years at North Star. She made captain at 34. She made check airman at 39. She was one of 18 black women in the United States holding a wide-body captain rating on a major carrier, and she knew each of the other 17 by name and by voice, because they had built, over the last 15 years, a small, quiet network of women who checked in with each other on the bad days. 3 weeks before the Frankfurt flight, she had accepted a senior position at Transcontinental Airways. The offer had included a check airman designation and a specific mandate. The specific mandate had come from the office of Transcontinental Airways chief executive, a woman named Diane Whittaker who had taken over the airline 18 months earlier and had spent the first year of her tenure reading, in the private conference room adjacent to her office, every internal report on crew culture that had been filed at the airline over the previous decade. What she had found had not surprised her. What she had found had also not been acceptable to her. And what she had done about it, 3 weeks before Janelle Hayes walked into the cockpit of Flight 447, was reach out through a private channel to Janelle at North Star Airways and make her an offer that had contained, in addition to a substantial increase in base salary and a signing bonus, a document that Janelle had read 4 times before she had agreed to sign it. The document was called the Check Airman Charter, and it had been drafted specifically for her. It authorized her to conduct check rides on any crew, any equipment, any route at her sole discretion for a period of 18 months. It authorized her to file crew resource management deficiency reports that would go directly to the chief pilot's office and to the office of the chief executive, bypassing the normal chain of review. It authorized her to recommend with immediate effect the removal of any crew member from active flight status pending a full behavioral review. And it contained, in the final paragraph, a clause that Janelle had read 6 times before she had signed it. The clause said, in language that had been drafted by the airline's general counsel and reviewed personally by Diane Whittaker, that the check airman was expressly authorized to conduct any check ride under whatever operational conditions she deemed most likely to produce accurate observations of ordinary crew behavior, including but not limited to boarding the aircraft under conditions that did not announce her rank or role in advance. Janelle had understood exactly what the clause was giving her. It was giving her permission to walk into cockpits looking like what she looked like, which was a black woman in her mid-40s in a plain blazer holding a flight bag, and it was giving her the professional standing to file, in her official capacity, a full report on what she observed in the 4 to 5 seconds before the crew realized who she was. She had, in the 3 weeks between accepting the offer and boarding Flight 447, made a list of 12 crews she wanted to observe under those conditions during her first 90 days. Blake Morrison's crew had been fourth on the list. She had chosen it fourth for a reason. Blake Morrison had 14 open cabin crew grievances in his personnel file, spread over the previous 6 years. 6 of them had been closed with a note that no further action was warranted. 4 had been closed after Morrison had participated in what the file described as a facilitated conversation with the complaining party. 2 had been closed after the complaining party had left the airline. The final 2 were still open. 9 of the 14 grievances had been filed by women. 6 of the 14 had been filed by women of color. The pattern in Morrison's file was not the loudest pattern in the 12 files Janelle had pulled. It was the second loudest. She had wanted to observe the second loudest pattern first because she had wanted, before she took on the loudest one, to know exactly what she was looking at. Now she was looking at it. And the officer sitting in the right-hand seat of the 787 was still trying, in the small silent way of a man whose entire professional architecture had just been rearranged around him, to figure out what he was allowed to say next. Chief Pilot Delacroix had opened the briefing packet on the small ledge between the 2 front seats. He was going through the flight plan aloud, reading route waypoints and fuel calculations, and expected weather at Frankfurt in the calm, unhurried voice of a man who had briefed 6,000 wide-body flights over the course of his career. Janelle Hayes was listening to him with the attentive stillness of a captain who had not yet decided how much of the briefing she was going to accept and how much she was going to redirect. Blake Morrison was listening too. He was also, in a small back corner of his mind, beginning to understand that his career at Transcontinental Airways had entered a phase he did not know how to manage. The briefing lasted 22 minutes. Chief Pilot Delacroix walked through the route from JFK to Frankfurt, the fuel load, the alternate airports, the expected turbulence over the North Atlantic between waypoint OYSDR and waypoint TUDEP, the crew rest rotation for the 8-hour flight, and the arrival procedures at Frankfurt. He did all of this without once looking at Blake Morrison. When he was finished, he closed the briefing folder and turned toward Janelle Hayes. "Captain, is there anything you would like to add before I leave the flight deck?" Janelle Hayes tilted her head very slightly to the right. She was, Blake Morrison had noticed over the last 22 minutes, a person who did most of her thinking with her face perfectly still and let a small tilt of her head signal the moment when a decision had been made. "Yes, Chief. Thank you. I would like to add 3 items before pushback." She turned in her seat so that she was facing the 2 officers behind her as well as Blake Morrison to her right. She did not raise her voice. "First, the events that occurred in this cockpit before Chief Pilot Delacroix arrived will be documented in a supplementary report that I will file at the completion of this trip. That report will go to the Chief Pilot's office and to the office of the Chief Executive. It will not affect the operational conduct of today's flight. I want that to be clear. We are going to fly this airplane to Frankfurt as a professional crew. Whatever consequences arise from the pre-briefing events will arise after we are on the ground at the hotel tomorrow morning. Between now and then, I expect every member of this crew to perform to the standard of the certificate you are each holding. Is that understood?" The relief pilot, whose name was Officer Grant Peterson, said, "Yes, Captain." Officer Chen said, "Yes, Captain." Blake Morrison said, "Yes, Captain." And the words came out of his mouth in a register he had not used since he had been a 24-year-old first officer at a regional carrier in Ohio. "Second, I want to establish crew resource management expectations for this trip that may differ from what this crew is accustomed to. I will be flying the left seat as pilot flying for the outbound leg. First Officer Morrison will be pilot monitoring. Officer Peterson will handle radio communications during the North Atlantic track crossing. Officer Chen, I would like you to run every checklist by the book. Not the shortened version, not the memorized version. By the book. If a checklist item is normally called and responded to in 3 seconds, I want to hear the full call and the full response, even if it takes 7. That is not a criticism of how this crew normally operates. It is a specification for how this crew is going to operate for the next 30 days. Is that understood? 3 voices answered yes. Blake Morrison's was the softest of the 3. Third. If at any point during this flight any member of this crew observes a decision I am making that they believe is unsafe, or that they do not understand, or that they simply want a question, I want them to speak up. I want them to speak up immediately. I want them to speak up without concern for hierarchy or for the ongoing evaluation. Crew resource management is the #1 predictor of accident survival in commercial aviation, and it does not function when junior crew members are afraid to challenge the captain. I am telling you now, on the record, in front of the chief pilot, that I want to be challenged when you have a concern. If I do not receive that challenge and it turns out later that you had a concern you did not raise, that will be documented in your evaluation as a CRM deficiency. Is that clear? The 3 voices said yes. This time Blake Morrison's was not the softest. He had, in some corner of himself that had not been touched by the last 25 minutes, understood that Janelle Hayes had just given him an instruction that was also a lifeline. She had told him, in as many words, that his path from the situation he was currently in did not run through silence or through apology. It ran through professional performance over the next 30 days at a level he had not been performing at for the last 15 years. Chief Pilot Delacroix nodded once. He stood. Chief Pilot Delacroix left the flight deck at 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time. The door closed behind him with a soft mechanical click that seemed, in the quiet of the cockpit, louder than it had any right to be. For a moment, none of the 4 officers said anything. Then Janelle Hayes reached for the checklist binder on the ledge beside her, opened it to the first page, and said, in the calm, professional voice of a captain who was ready to begin the work of the day, "Before start checklist, please." Officer Chen, at her station, cleared her throat. "Parking brake." Janelle glanced down at the center console. "Set. Fuel pumps. On all 6. Beacon light. On." The checklist moved through its normal sequence with the deliberate cadence Janelle had specified. Blake Morrison, in the right-hand seat, responded to every call in a voice that was slightly too crisp, the voice of a man who had been given a second chance he did not yet believe he had been given, and was determined not to squander the first 10 minutes of it. Officer Peterson, at the jump seat, handled the radio call to ground control for pushback clearance with a professionalism that was, if anything, more precise than the flight deck standard. The 787 pushed back from the gate at 7:04 a.m., 14 minutes ahead of the scheduled departure time. The 2 General Electric engines spooled up with the deep, contained hum that Blake Morrison had heard 3,000 times in his career, and that had never once, until this morning, felt to him like a sound he was on probation to earn. Ground control cleared them to taxiway November. Janelle Hayes eased the tiller forward with her left hand, and the aircraft began to roll. For the next 90 minutes, from taxi through takeoff through initial climb through the level-off at their assigned cruise altitude of 37,000 ft, the 4 officers of Flight 447 flew the airplane the way it had been designed to be flown. Every call was made. Every response was given. Every checklist was completed in its proper sequence at its proper time. Janelle Hayes flew the departure procedure out of JFK with the smooth, unhurried inputs of a pilot who had 9,200 hours of pilot and command time on wide-body equipment, and had earned every one of them. Blake Morrison monitored the flight instruments and made the calls of a pilot monitoring who was, for perhaps the first time in the last decade, actually monitoring. At 8:37 a.m., over the coast of Newfoundland, with the aircraft established on the North Atlantic track and the autopilot flying the aircraft with the patient competence of the machines that now flew most of the routes on the planet. Janelle Hayes reached forward and dimmed her cockpit lights one notch. She said, without turning her head, "First Officer Morrison, I would like to have a conversation with you now if this is a good time." Blake Morrison in the right seat did not answer immediately. He had been waiting for this conversation for 4 hours. He had not known when it would come. He had known only that it would. "Yes, Captain, this is a good time. Officer Peterson, Officer Chen, this conversation will be part of the record of this flight. You are both encouraged to listen. You are not required to comment." The two voices behind him acknowledged. Officer Peterson said, "Yes, Captain." Officer Chen said, "Yes, Captain." Neither of them moved. Janelle Hayes turned her seat about 15 degrees to her right so that she was facing Blake Morrison in a three-quarter profile. She did not look at him with anger. She did not look at him with sympathy. She looked at him with the attentive assessing gaze of a Czech airman who was going to conduct, in the next several minutes, the most important debrief of Blake Morrison's career, and who intended to conduct it with the same professional precision she had brought to every other action she had taken that morning. "First Officer Morrison, I want to talk to you about what happened in the cockpit this morning before Chief Pilot Delacroix arrived. I want to tell you what I observed. I want to tell you what I concluded from what I observed, and I want to give you the opportunity to respond. This is not a formal disciplinary conversation. Those will happen through the appropriate channels after we land in Frankfurt. This is a professional conversation between two officers of this airline, one of whom is evaluating the other, and both of whom are going to have to work together for the next 30 days. I would like us to have it honestly, because honesty is going to be the only thing that determines whether the next 30 days are useful to either of us. Do you understand what I am saying?" Blake Morrison said. "Yes, Captain." His voice was flat and steady. He had, in the 4 hours since Chief Pilot Delacroix had left the flight deck, arrived at a place inside himself he had not visited in a long time. It was the place a person arrives at when the story they have been telling themselves about their own life has stopped working and there is nothing left to do but sit with what actually happened. "Good. Then I will begin. When I walked through the door of this cockpit at 6:31 this morning, you did not look up from your tablet. You made a joke about the galley and the crew rest area. You told me the coffee station was behind me and that you took yours black with 2 sugars. Your colleagues laughed. I want to ask you a question and I want you to answer it honestly. When you said those things, did you believe I was a flight attendant or did you believe I was something else?" Blake Morrison did not answer immediately. He looked out through the forward cockpit window at the layer of high cirrus clouds stretched over the North Atlantic beneath them, and for the first time since he had put on the uniform of Transcontinental Airways 22 years earlier, he asked himself the question the way it had actually been asked, the way it required to be answered. "Captain, I did not believe you were a flight attendant. I did not believe anything specific. I saw a black woman in a blazer walk through the cockpit door, and I made a joke that I have made before. I have made it when white women have walked through the door too. I have told myself for a long time that it is a joke about anyone who is not a pilot, but I have not made it every time a person who is not a pilot has walked through that door. I have made it selectively. And if I am being honest with you, which I am trying to be, I have made it more often when the person walking through the door has been a woman, and I have made it more often when the person walking through the door has been black or brown." Janelle Hayes did not respond. She waited. She had learned, over the 15 years she had been holding difficult conversations with men who had said things they should not have said, that the most useful thing she could do in the 10 seconds after a real answer was to say nothing and let the real answer sit in the air. Blake Morrison, who had expected her to speak, understood after the 10 seconds had passed that she was not going to, and he continued. "I have a daughter, Captain. She is 19. She is a sophomore in college. She wants to be an aerospace engineer. I have told her since she was small that she can be anything she wants to be, and I have believed myself when I said it. And I have to tell you that in the last 4 hours, sitting in this seat, I have been thinking about what would have happened if my daughter had been the one who walked through that cockpit door this morning in a plain blazer with a flight bag, and if she had been the one who heard what came out of my mouth. And I cannot get comfortable with the answer to that question. I am telling you that because you asked me to be honest, and because I do not think I can sit in this seat for the next 30 days pretending I have not thought it. Janelle Hayes was quiet for another moment. When she spoke, her voice had not changed. It was the same calm, even voice she had used since she had walked into the cockpit. First Officer Morrison, I appreciate that answer. I want to tell you what I am going to do with it. I am going to include it in my report verbatim because that is my obligation as check airman. But I am also going to include verbatim the sentence you said before it. The sentence in which you told me you have made that joke selectively. Because that sentence, first officer, is the sentence that matters. Most men in your position would not have said it. Most men in your position would have told me they were sorry, that it had been a misunderstanding, that they had been tired, that the joke was about pilots in general, that they had a black friend, that their wife was Filipino, that they had grown up in a diverse neighborhood, that they had always supported affirmative action in principle. I have heard every one of those sentences in the last 15 years, and I have written every one of them into a report, and I have watched the officers who said them keep saying them for the rest of their careers, because the sentence they said was not the sentence that would let them change. The sentence they said was the sentence that would let them stay the same. She paused. The autopilot made a small correction to the aircraft's heading. The Atlantic slid past 37,000 ft beneath them. The sentence you said is different. The sentence you said is a sentence a person cannot say and remain unchanged, because the person who says it has already begun to see themselves. I am not going to tell you what is going to happen to you at Transcontinental Airways in the next several weeks. That decision is not mine alone to make. I'm going to tell you that the sentence you just said has given me a reason to include in my report, a recommendation that had not been in the report I was planning to file 4 hours ago. I'm going to recommend that you be enrolled in the airline's Crew Resource Management Remediation Program, that you complete a 90-day supervised evaluation period at the end of the remediation program, and that at the end of that period, you be evaluated for return to unrestricted line duty. I am going to recommend that instead of termination. That is the recommendation. Whether it is accepted is not up to me. Blake Morrison did not respond immediately. He looked down at his hands, which were resting on his knees, and he noticed for the first time in a long time that they were the hands of a 47-year-old man who had been given, in the last 4 hours, an opportunity he had not earned and did not, by any reasonable accounting, deserve. Captain, thank you. Janelle Hayes turned her seat back to its neutral position. She reached forward and returned the cockpit lights to their previous setting. She said, "Officer Peterson, please contact Gander Oceanic and request a position report at 50 West." Officer Peterson said, "Yes, Captain," and reached for the radio. The flight to Frankfurt continued for another 5 hours and 41 minutes. It was, by every metric a check airman was trained to measure, one of the smoothest transatlantic crossings any of the 4 officers on the flight deck had ever flown. The aircraft landed at Frankfurt Airport at 8:12 p.m. local time, on schedule, in a light rain that had drifted in from the North Sea over the course of the afternoon. Captain Janelle Hayes taxied the aircraft to gate B44 and completed the shutdown checklist with Officer Chen, calling every item exactly as she had been instructed to that morning, at full length, without abbreviation. The 4 officers walked off the flight deck together. They collected their flight bags from the crew closet. They said their brief professional goodbyes to the cabin crew at the forward galley. They walked up the jet bridge into the terminal and through customs, and into the crew van that was waiting to take them to the hotel in the small nearby town where Transcontinental Airways housed its Frankfurt crews. Nobody in the van spoke for the first 10 minutes of the ride. Then Officer Chen, in the seat behind Janelle Hayes, said quietly, "Captain, I want to tell you that this was the best flown wide-body flight I have been on in 7 years at this airline. Thank you." Janelle Hayes turned in her seat and said, "Officer Chen, I want to tell you that your checklist discipline today was the reason it was flown that way. Thank you." Officer Chen did not answer. She did not need to. There are moments in a person's professional life when a sentence from someone whose opinion has been earned lands in a place that no other sentence has ever reached. And Officer Chen, who was 33 years old and had been a flight engineer at Transcontinental Airways for 6 years, and had never, in those 6 years, been told by any captain that her checklist discipline was the reason a flight had been flown well, sat in the back of the crew van and looked out the window at the German countryside sliding past in the rain, and she did not answer, because the answer she wanted to give was not one she could compose in the presence of 3 other officers. The van reached the hotel at 9:04 p.m. The 4 officers checked in and went to their separate rooms. Janelle Hayes ordered room service and ate at the small desk by the window and wrote the first draft of her report on Flight 447 in a leather-bound notebook she carried in the inner pocket of her flight bag. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote about Blake Morrison. She wrote about Officer Peterson, whose nervous laughter she had noted and would recommend for a lighter form of remediation. She wrote about Officer Chen, whose silence during the pre-briefing events she had also noted, and whose subsequent professional performance she had also noted, and whose case, she was concluding, was a case of a competent officer working inside a crew culture that had not made room for her to speak. She wrote about Blake Morrison's daughter. She thought for a long time before she wrote that part, and then she wrote it anyway. She closed the notebook at 11:14 p.m. She looked out the window at the small German town, at the lights of a bakery across the street where a woman was closing up for the night, and she thought about her father, who had died 6 years earlier, and who had never gotten to see her make captain. She thought about her mother, who was 78 and living in a small house in Baton Rouge, and who called her every Sunday. She thought about the 17 other black women who held wide-body captain ratings at major U.S. carriers, and about the small, quiet network they had built, and she made a mental note to send a message to 2 of them in the morning. 6 weeks later, First Officer Blake Morrison entered the Crew Resource Management Remediation Program. He completed it in 90 days. He completed the supervised evaluation period 6 months after that. He returned to unrestricted line duty at Transcontinental Airways in the spring of the following year, and he flew for the airline for another 11 years before retiring in his early 60s. In the last decade of his career, no cabin crew grievances were filed against him. He also, in the 3rd year after the flight to Frankfurt, requested and received an assignment as a mentor pilot in the airline's Diversity in Aviation Cadet program, which had been expanded that year under the recommendation of the Czech Airman Charter. He mentored, over the 8 years he served in that role, 22 cadets, 17 of whom were women, 13 of whom were women of color. One of them, in the 7th year of the program, was a young woman from a small town in southern Alabama whose father had also been a mechanic. Captain Janelle Hayes completed her Czech Airman assignment 18 months after it began. She filed 47 supplementary reports over that period. She recommended termination in 6 cases. She recommended remediation in 19. She recommended no action in 22. She was promoted to chief pilot of the 787 fleet in the 2nd year after the Czech period ended. She was promoted to vice president of flight operations 3 years after that. In her office at Transcontinental Airways headquarters, on the wall behind her desk, she kept 2 photographs. One was of a 9-year-old girl standing in a chain-link fenced yard behind a 2-bedroom house in Plaquemine, Louisiana, watching a crop duster bank over a sugar cane field. The other was of her father. So here is what I want you to sit with, and I want your honest answer in the comments. What would you have done in that cockpit, not as Captain Hayes, as one of the other officers in the room? Would you have laughed? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have spoken up? Because the answer to that question is the whole point. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.